My friend swore it was just an optical illusion, a hitchhiker standing perfectly still in the dead of night, only to vanish when they blinked. But then another friend told a similar story, and another. These aren't just urban legends. These are true accounts from drivers who've come face to face with the inexplicable on desolate highways. Are you ready to hear what truly lurks beyond the reach of your headlights? It was a Tuesday in late October when Derek Holt found himself driving alone on Route 9 through the flatlands of rural Nebraska. He was a practical man, a structural engineer by trade, someone who lived and breathed measurements, logic, and certainty. He had driven this stretch of highway dozens of times over the years. He knew every gas station, every crumbling billboard, every curve and incline like the back of his hand. So when his headlights caught the silhouette of a young woman standing on the shoulder of the road, thumb extended, he did not panic. He slowed down and pulled over. She was maybe 20 years old, dressed in a pale blue dress that seemed entirely inappropriate for the biting autumn cold. Her hair was dark and hung loose around her face. She said nothing as she climbed into the back seat. Derek asked where she was headed. She gave the name of a town about 40 miles south, a small place called Millhaven. He nodded and pulled back onto the road. He adjusted his rear-view mirror, checked on her instinctively, and caught the faintest reflection of her face, pale, expressionless, eyes fixed on the passing darkness beyond the window. They drove in silence for nearly 15 minutes. Derek tried twice more to make conversation. She gave short, flat answers. He let it go. Some people do not want to talk, and he understood that. He turned on the radio, low and static-filled, and kept his eyes on the road. Then, without any particular reason, he glanced again at the rear-view mirror. The back seat was empty. The door had not opened, the locks were still engaged, there had been no sound, no movement, nothing at all. She was simply gone. Derek pulled over immediately. His hands were shaking. He got out and checked the back seat, the floor, the trunk, everywhere. There was nothing. But there was something, and this is the part that Derek still cannot explain to this day. On the back seat where she had been sitting was a single white flower, not wilted, not crumpled from the drive, fresh, as if it had just been picked. He later identified it as a paper white narcissus, a flower traditionally associated with death and the underworld in several cultures. He has never driven Route 9 at night again. What Derek experienced has a name, or at least researchers and folklorists have tried to give it one. The phantom hitchhiker is one of the oldest and most persistently reported supernatural phenomena associated with road travel. Cases matching Derek's account have been documented across the United States, the United Kingdom, South Africa, the Philippines, and dozens of other countries. The details vary. Sometimes the figure leaves behind a scarf, sometimes a locket, sometimes nothing at all. But the pattern is always the same: a solitary driver, a stranger in need, a disappearance that defies every law of physics and reason. What makes these accounts so deeply unsettling is not just the vanishing itself, but what tends to follow. Drivers who experience phantom hitchhiker encounters frequently report the same things in the days afterwards: an overwhelming sense of being watched, recurring dreams of the road, and an inability to shake the feeling that something followed them home. Derek reported all three. His wife noticed a change in him within 48 hours. She described him as distant, pale, and constantly looking over his shoulder. Some researchers who study road phenomena believe the explanation lies not in the supernatural, but in the road itself. There is a growing body of thought suggesting that certain stretches of highway carry what can only be described as residual energy, a kind of psychological imprint left behind by trauma, accidents, deaths, tragedies that occurred at those exact coordinates over decades or even centuries. The idea is that under the right conditions, isolation, darkness, emotional vulnerability, some people become receptive to that energy in ways that produce vivid, undeniable experiences, not hallucinations, something else entirely, something that leaves flowers on back seats. A woman named Priya Anand, a nurse from Tucson, Arizona, had her encounter not on a highway, but on a winding mountain road in New Mexico in the summer of 2019. She picked up an elderly man in a gray coat who told her he was trying to get back to his daughter's house after his car broke down. He gave her an address. He sat quietly in the passenger seat, hands folded in his lap. She reached over to offer him a bottle of water, and when she turned back to the road, the seat was vacant. The water bottle fell through the air where he should have been and landed on the floor. She drove to the address he had given her anyway. She's not sure why, only that something compelled her. The house existed. An elderly woman answered the door. When Priya described the man, the woman's face went white. She said her father had died on that exact stretch of road 11 years earlier. These roads remember what happened on them, and sometimes they make sure you do too. The question that should be lodging itself in your mind right now, the question that will stay with you for the rest of this story, is this: what if the hitchhiker is not trying to get somewhere? What if they are trying to bring you somewhere instead? Long-haul truckers spend more time on desolate roads than almost anyone else alive. They know the loneliness of highways at 3 in the morning, the way a road can feel endless and oppressive, the strange intimacy that develops between a driver and the dark. They also know things that most people do not, things they do not always talk about in diners or truck stops, at least not to strangers. But when pressed, when the conversation turns serious and the hour turns late, many of them will admit to encounters that have never left them. Thomas Garraway has been driving long haul for 22 years. He runs a regular route between Memphis and Denver, cutting across Oklahoma and the Texas Panhandle, through some of the most genuinely remote stretches of road in the continental United States. He is not, by his own description, a superstitious man. He does not believe in ghosts. He does not scare easily. But he will tell you, without hesitation, about the figures. He first noticed them about 7 years into his career. He was driving through a stretch of Oklahoma highway around 2 a.m., a section of road so empty that he sometimes went an hour without seeing another vehicle. He caught something in his peripheral vision, a shape standing just at the edge of where his headlights dissolved into blackness. He thought it was a person at first, but then he passed it, and it did not move the way a person would. It did not flinch from the headlights. It did not turn. It stood perfectly, absolutely still, facing the road. And it was tall, taller than any person he had ever seen. He dismissed it the first time, told himself it was a shadow, a dead tree, a roadside marker playing tricks on tired eyes. But it happened again the following week on the same route, and again the week after that, always at the edge of the light, always still, always watching. He started calling them the Watchers privately, a name he never used out loud until years later when a fellow driver named Cortez Webb described the exact same figures on the same stretch of road without any prompting from Thomas whatsoever. What makes the Watchers so uniquely terrifying is their consistency. Across dozens of independent accounts gathered from drivers in Oklahoma, Kansas, Nevada, and the rural backroads of Montana, the description is remarkably uniform. Tall figures, sometimes appearing to lack clearly defined features, standing just beyond the illuminated range of headlights, never moving, never following, only watching. Some witnesses describe a faint wrongness to the darkness around their form, not a glow exactly, but a distortion, as if the air itself behaves differently near them. And here is the detail that appears in account after account, the detail that no one who has not experienced it can quite prepare for. The sensation, as you pass, that the figure's attention has moved to follow you, even though nothing else about it has shifted at all. One theory, proposed by investigators of unexplained phenomena, is that these figures are a form of shadow person, entities reported across cultures and throughout recorded history that appear as dark, humanoid shapes at the edges of perception. Shadow people are most commonly reported during states of sleep paralysis or near sleep, but a significant number of accounts come from people who are wide awake and in states of heightened alertness. Driving alone at night on an empty highway produces exactly the kind of focused, hyper-vigilant awareness that some researchers believe makes these entities more perceptible to us, or perhaps more chillingly, makes us more perceptible to them. Then there are the animals. This element of road encounters is discussed far less frequently, but it is no less consistent across the accounts. Dozens of drivers have reported animals behaving in ways that seemed profoundly, wrongly unnatural. Deer standing in the middle of the road, completely unresponsive to headlights or horn, staring with an intelligence that felt deliberate. Birds gathered in enormous, silent numbers on power lines above the road, all facing the same direction in the middle of the night. A woman named Odette Marsh described driving through rural Louisiana and watching a pack of coyotes walk in a perfect single-file line across the road, completely synchronized, without any of the erratic, fractured movement that coyotes always display. They moved, she said, like they were being operated by something else entirely. The psychological dimension of these encounters cannot be dismissed, but it also cannot fully explain them away. Yes, fatigue distorts perception. Yes, the human brain is wired to detect threats and will sometimes manufacture them from shadow and suggestion. But Thomas Garraway was not tired when he first saw the watchers. Odette Marsh had slept 8 hours the night before her coyote encounter. Cortez Webb was drinking his third cup of coffee when he saw his first figure standing at the roadside. Fatigue is a convenient explanation. It is also, in many of these cases, simply not accurate. And here is the element that fatigue cannot account for at all: the photographic evidence. Multiple drivers, independently and without any coordination between them, have captured images on dash cam footage or mobile phone cameras that show shapes at the roadside that cannot be explained by shadow or lens distortion. Shapes that, when enlarged and examined by independent analysts, appear to have depth, texture, and in several documented cases, what appears to be a face turned directly toward the recording device. These images exist. They have been analyzed. They have not been debunked. They simply remain unanswered, filed away in the space between what science can explain and what it cannot yet bring itself to name. The road has witnesses of its own. And tonight, as you hear this, somewhere out there, a driver is moving through the dark, headlights cutting their narrow corridor of light through an infinite blackness, and at the very edge of that light, just beyond where the eye can comfortably reach, something tall and patient is very, very still, There is a particular kind of fear that belongs only to the lost. Not the ordinary, inconvenient sensation of missing a turn or arriving late. Something much older than that. The fear of following a road that leads somewhere it has no right to lead. The fear of realizing, too late, that the road you are on is not on any map and may never have been. In the summer of 2021, a man named Gideon Ashworth was driving home to Portland, Oregon from a work conference in Sacramento. He had made the drive before, knew it reasonably well, and despite the late hour, he felt confident enough to skip the last planned motel stop and push through to finish the trip in one stretch. Somewhere south of Grants Pass, around midnight, his GPS lost signal. He was not worried. He knew the general route. He took what he was certain was a familiar exit and headed north. That was the last familiar thing about the next 3 hours of his life. The road narrowed gradually. He told himself it was simply a secondary highway, that he would merge back onto the interstate before long. But the road kept narrowing. The trees on either side grew increasingly dense, their branches reaching over the asphalt in a way that felt intentional, almost architectural, like a tunnel being deliberately closed around him. His headlights caught the road ahead, and he noticed something that made his breath stop. There were no reflective road markers, no painted lines, no signs of any kind. Just dark asphalt stretching forward in a road that looked somehow older than the surrounding landscape, as if the trees had grown up around it rather than been cleared to make room for it. He drove for another 20 minutes before he saw the house. It appeared suddenly on his right, set back from the road, a structure that looked as if it had been built in the 1920s and had not been maintained since. Every window was dark, except one on the upper floor, which held a dim orange-yellow light that pulsed faintly, not like a candle, not like a lamp, but with a rhythm that suggested something biological, something breathing. He slowed without consciously deciding to do so. He later said that every rational instinct told him to keep driving, but he slowed, and in that moment, he saw a figure step into the window frame on the upper floor and look directly at him. Not at his car, at him specifically. Through the glass, through the dark, across the distance, directly at him. He accelerated, he drove fast and did not stop and did not check his mirrors. When he finally found his way back to a recognizable road, his GPS reconnected and showed him, according to its records, that he had been stationary for the past 3 hours. He had not been stationary. He had driven over 40 miles on that road. Those 40 miles did not appear on any map he could find, and that GPS record has never been explained. This type of experience has a name in paranormal research, a ghost road, or sometimes a road that does not belong. The accounts of encountering them share an almost identical structure. The gradual narrowing, the absence of standard road markings, the sense of the landscape pressing in, the appearance of structures or figures that seem to belong to a different era entirely, and always the inexplicable discrepancy between what the driver experienced and what recorded time and location data shows afterward. A woman named Felicity Crane, a high school teacher from rural Kentucky, had a similar experience in 2018 on a road she had driven hundreds of times before. She turned onto what she was certain was the county road that passed her family's farm. Everything looked right. The same trees, the same gentle curve, the same familiar darkness. But the road kept going. It should have reached her driveway in under 2 minutes. It did not. She drove for what felt like 30 minutes down a road she knew with absolute certainty ended less than a mile from where she had turned. When she finally stopped and turned around, her driveway appeared within 30 seconds of her U-turn. She has no explanation, neither does anyone else. Researchers who study liminal spaces, transitional zones that exist between defined places and purposes, believe these incidents may be linked to something fundamental about the nature of isolated road travel. The argument is that roads cutting through genuinely remote and ancient landscapes sometimes exist at the boundary between what is and what was, that under specific conditions, night, isolation, a mind focused purely on forward motion, a driver can slip without noticing into the space between. Roland Vance, a former geologist, turned onto an overgrown dirt road in southern Utah while surveying land in 2020. The road was not on his maps. He followed it out of professional curiosity, assuming it was an old mining access road. What he found at its end was a clearing, and in the clearing were 12 cars, different makes, different model years, arranged in a rough circle, not crashed, not abandoned in any conventional sense, parked carefully and deliberately, as if their drivers had simply gotten out and walked away. Engines off, doors closed, keys in every vehicle he checked still in the ignition. He reported it to local authorities. They found the clearing. They cataloged every car. Every single one had been reported missing in a separate incident spanning 40 years. Their drivers were never found. The road led somewhere all right. The question is whether anyone who follows one of those roads far enough ever truly finds their way back. Sound does something to a person on a long, empty road that nothing else quite replicates. In the ordinary world, silence is rare. There is always ambient noise, always something to orient us, to remind us that we exist within a living, populated world. But on a desolate highway at 2 a.m, the silence becomes a presence of its own. It presses against the windows of the car. It fills the interior with a weight that feels almost physical. And it is into this silence, this profound, pressing absence of normal sound, that the wrong sounds arrive. A man named Calvin Riggs had been driving through the Mojave Desert for 6 hours when it began. He was experienced with desert roads and had always found the emptiness peaceful rather than threatening. But on this particular night in September of 2022, somewhere between Needles and Barstow, the air inside his car changed. He described it later as a sudden drop in temperature, not gradual, not like the air conditioning cutting in, but sudden and total, as if he had driven into a pocket of winter. His breath fogged in the air in front of his face, the hairs on his arms rose. And then, from the back seat, he heard a voice. It was low and indistinct at first, like someone whispering at the very edge of audibility. He turned the radio off. He confirmed, for what he later counted as the 3rd time, that he was completely alone in the car. The voice continued. He could not make out words for the first several minutes, only the unmistakable rhythm and cadence of speech, of someone talking continuously in a register just below comprehension. Then, for approximately 10 seconds, it became clear enough to understand. It said distinctly and without any variation in tone, "You should have stopped at the light." He had run a yellow light roughly 40 miles back. He had thought nothing of it at the time. Calvin pulled over immediately. He sat on the shoulder of the desert highway for 45 minutes before he felt capable of continuing. He never heard the voice again after that night, but when he arrived at his destination and stepped out of the car, he found the back seat cold to the touch. Not cool from the car's air conditioning, but cold in a way that persisted for hours after parking in the desert heat. A cold that had no natural source and no natural explanation. The phenomenon of auditory experiences in isolated road conditions is reported far more frequently than most people know. Part of the reason is simple reluctance. Most people who experience these things are afraid describing them will lead others to question their mental stability. But when researchers specifically solicit accounts from long-distance drivers, the volume of reported auditory incidents is remarkable. Whispers, crying, full conversations emanating from empty back seats, laughter with no apparent source, music playing from no active device, and, most disturbingly, voices that appear to possess specific knowledge about the driver, about their recent decisions, about events that occurred on the road earlier in the journey. A journalist named Imara Tilatir spent 6 months collecting accounts from long-haul drivers and night shift workers who regularly traveled isolated highways across the American South. What she found was a pattern so consistent it unsettled her professionally. In case after case, the auditory experience was preceded by the exact same 2 things: a sudden temperature drop inside the vehicle and a brief but intense smell, not of anything rotting or sulfurous, but of something ordinary and domestic. Perfume, baking bread, fresh coffee. A smell that had absolutely no business existing in the middle of an empty desert at 3 in the morning. As if something was announcing its presence with a borrowed memory. The movement of objects is another element that appears in these accounts with unnerving regularity. Calvin Riggs found his phone on the passenger side floor when he had placed it securely in the center console. A trucker named Bernard Yates reported that a coffee thermos he kept in a specific holder on every single drive was found on one particular night in rural Wyoming in the back cargo area, discovered after a stretch of road where he had heard what sounded exactly like slow, deliberate breathing directly behind his seat. A family driving at night through West Virginia found their youngest child's stuffed animal moved from the back seat to the front passenger seat while all 3 children were asleep and both parents faced forward. Their dash cam recorded nothing, no hand, no movement visible at any point, only the toy in one position and then, without transition, in another. There is something about the interior of a car on an empty road at night that seems to concentrate whatever exists at certain road locations. Some theorists believe the vehicle acts as a container, holding energy or presence within its enclosed space. Others point to the documented reality of infrasound, low-frequency sound waves below the threshold of human hearing, produced by certain wind conditions or geographical features, which can produce physical unease, the perception of presences, and auditory experiences that feel entirely real. Infrasound is a genuine, documented phenomenon. It is more common in isolated rural landscapes than anywhere else on Earth. But infrasound does not explain specific voices. It does not explain a voice that knows you ran a yellow light 40 miles back and tells you you should have stopped. That requires something else, something that has been watching the road long before your headlights ever reached it, and something that, once it has spoken to you, you will find it very difficult to forget. We have traveled, over the course of this story, through some of the most unsettling and inexplicable encounters ever reported from the Unending road. We have followed Derek Holt down Route 9 and watched a young woman vanish from a locked car, leaving behind a flower that had no right to be there. We have stood at the edge of Thomas Garraway's headlights and felt the weight of something tall and motionless watching from the dark. We have driven Gideon Ashworth's Impossible road and stood in Roland Vance's clearing, surrounded by 12 cars whose drivers disappeared across 4 decades. We have sat with Calvin Riggs in the Mojave and heard a voice from an empty seat say something it could not possibly have known. Now comes the question that every one of these accounts ultimately forces into the open. What is actually out there? The options, when laid out with honesty, are none of them comfortable. The first is the rational explanation that all of these accounts, despite their remarkable consistency across cultures and geography, despite the physical evidence and the dash cam footage and the GPS anomalies and the circles of silently parked cars, are products of the human mind under stress, fatigue, isolation, the neurological effects of infrasound, the brain's profound capacity for filling gaps in perception with whatever the subconscious fears most. This is the explanation that requires the least rearrangement of our understanding of the world. It is also, when you sit with the specific details of these accounts, the explanation that requires the greatest willingness to look away from what the evidence actually shows. The second possibility is the one that most of these witnesses gravitate toward, reluctantly and with great personal discomfort, that certain roads, particularly those crossing ancient land, passing through sites of repeated human tragedy, winding through landscapes undisturbed by modern activity for centuries, exist in a relationship with something that our current framework of science does not adequately describe. Call it residual energy, call it dimensional porosity, call it whatever language makes it easier to hold. The effect remains the same. Things appear on these roads that have no business being there. Things leave physical evidence. Things possess specific knowledge. Things follow people home, and they wait. The third possibility is the one that researchers will rarely state publicly, but many will acknowledge privately in conversations conducted away from professional scrutiny. That the roads are not passive environments through which these phenomena happen to manifest. That the roads themselves are, in some sense that resists easy articulation, participants, not alive in any biological sense, but holding something of every person and every event that ever passed through them, and that under certain conditions they act on it. They pull certain drivers onto certain roads at certain times. They construct encounters, and the purpose behind that construction is not always transparent. It is not always something you would want to understand. A woman named Georgiana Falk wrote to a researcher of unexplained phenomena in 2023. Her letter, shared publicly with her permission, described an encounter on a highway in rural Idaho in which she saw, caught in her headlights, a child standing in the center of the road. A boy, perhaps 8 years old, standing completely still, wearing clothes that appeared thoroughly wet despite the dry night around him. She brought her car to a stop. She got out. She walked toward the child, and she described with precise and careful language the exact moment she understood that something was wrong, not with the boy, but with the road surrounding her. The asphalt, she wrote, was warm, not ambient temperature, warm the way skin is warm, warm the way something living is warm from the inside. She returned to her car. The boy was gone. She drove without stopping for 200 miles. She ended her letter with a question. She asked, if the roads remember everything that has happened on them, and if they can reach out and show you what they remember, then what do they want from us when they do it? What are they trying to say? That question has no answer yet. What we have instead are the accounts themselves, and they keep arriving. Every week, somewhere in the world, the driver pulls over on the shoulder of an empty road with shaking hands and a story they are not sure anyone will believe. A hitchhiker who left a flower, a figure that stood too still, a voice that knew too much, a road that should not have existed. They share these stories because the act of telling them is, at least partially, a way of surviving them, of processing the fundamental fracture when something impossible intrudes on your life, and you have to find a way to go on existing in a world that insists the impossible does not happen. The rules of the unending road, if such things can be named, appear to be these. Do not stop for figures standing too still at the roadside. Do not follow roads that narrow without warning signs. Do not speak to voices coming from empty seats. Do not dismiss the sudden cold, the inexplicable domestic smell, the animals that move in ways animals do not move. And above all, do not reassure yourself when you finally pull into your driveway and step out into the ordinary morning light that nothing happened on that road, because the road remembers. And whatever moves beyond your headlights has demonstrated consistently that it is patient, persistent, and not at all troubled by the fact that you cannot see it clearly. The accounts gathered here represent only a fraction of what has been reported. Hundreds of drivers from every profession, every country, every conceivable background have described encounters sharing these same dark and consistent threads. They cannot all be mistaken. They cannot all be dismissed. And whatever explanation eventually emerges, scientific, supernatural, or something we do not have language for, it will have to account for all of it. The flowers, the figures, the impossible roads, the cold that stays warm, and the voice in the back seat that already knows what you did 40 miles ago. So the next time you find yourself alone on a road that stretches further than it should, in that hollow hour between midnight and dawn when your headlights feel impossibly small against the infinite dark ahead of you, remember what you heard tonight. Remember that the light only reaches so far, and remember that whatever exists beyond that boundary has never been limited by that boundary at all. Drive carefully, and whatever you do, do not look away from the road. If any part of what you heard tonight connects to something you have experienced yourself, a figure, a sound, a road that felt wrong, an encounter you have carried for years without knowing how to explain it, share it in the comments below. You are far from alone. These experiences have been shared by more people than you know, and the attempt to understand them together is a conversation worth having. Your account may be exactly what helps someone else make sense of theirs. The road does not end when you reach your destination. It simply waits for you to return.